Thank you, everyone. Welcome back to our second round of short talks and closing remarks. Our first presenter for the second round of short talks is Danny Kirsch from Oklahoma State University.
All right, am I good to go?
Look good.
All right, perfect. Hello, everyone. So my name's Danny Kirsch, and I'm a research data specialist at Oklahoma State University. So today I'm going to be largely talking about kind of the divides and overlaps between data librarians and researchers, and both from my personal perspective and using some literature as well. So first I'll talk about my own journey from PhD to library, some problematic divides that I see between these two camps, as well as some promising overlaps, and then finally some strategies that I think can improve cooperation between data librarians and researchers. So first, my PhD journey. So I graduated with degrees in biology and Spanish from Southeast Missouri State University back in 2018, and then moved on to Oklahoma State University that fall to start a PhD program in integrative biology. My dissertation's focused on predator-prey interactions. So I look at things like duration, intensity, and timing of predation risk and how it affects things like behavior and physiology in a particular species of pond snail. And fingers crossed, if things go according to plan, I should be defending this coming spring. So I'm very excited about that. But I guess one kind of common thread that's followed me throughout my research journey is just my love of data. As much as I enjoy the actual wet lab experiments, like raising the snails, collecting the data, what I always look forward to is actually cleaning the data and then analyzing it and visualizing it. And so I think that was kind of my main entry into data librarianship. So my primary analysis and visualization program is R&R Studio. So back in spring 2021, I put together a relatively short intro to R workshop geared towards undergraduates. I was introduced to R as an undergraduate, and I think that's one thing that really helped me be successful as a researcher. So I wanted to kind of pay it forward to our undergraduate researchers at OSU. And then after a couple semesters of teaching these workshops, my flyers landed in the inbox of a couple librarians in our research and learning services department who are really involved with our campus carpentries program. So I know we had a session earlier that talked about carpentries, but just again, to briefly reiterate kind of the carpentries mission, this is a global group, and they're really keen on introducing novice learners to foundational coding and programming skills. And so that kind of connected me with these two individuals, brought me into learning about carpentries and so on. And then that fall, I started working as a graduate research assistant in that department. And that was really my first introduction to research data services writ large. And thanks to a heavy amount of support, both from my immediate supervisor as well as some of our administration, I was able to take advantage of a lot of opportunities for professional development. I was given autonomy to instruct workshops on certain topics. I got carpentry certified, all sorts of wonderful experiences. And then this summer, I started a full-time position as a research data specialist. And at this point, this is the direction that I'm planning on taking my professional career. I absolutely love data librarianship. All right, so given my personal experience as well as, again, kind of digging into the literature a little bit, there's a few key problematic divides that I see that I think make communication between data librarians and researchers not always successful. The first major one is a motivation mismatch. So any of you who've worked with academic researchers before, you're probably familiar with the term publish or perish. But basically this idea that in a lot of cases, the way that researchers get credit for the work that they're doing, the way that they're seen as quote unquote successful is based on how many publications they're getting. And so particularly at very research intensive universities, you're going to see this really rapid pace of grant to publication. And although this is changing, thankfully, there is still a decent bias towards publishing positive and novel results as opposed to null or negative results. But again, there are journals that are pushing against this. There's sort of a cultural shift against this, but still, it's just kind of this push for publish as quickly as you can and publish the things that are flashy. And kind of along with that is reappointment, promotion, and tenure expectations. So whether or not they think it's what should be valued, those do set criteria for what researchers get credit for. Is it how many publications they've gotten? Is it the impact factors of the journals they're publishing in? Things like that. So that's what's ultimately going to be motivating where these researchers are allocating their time and energy. Whereas from the librarian perspectives, there's a really strong value for things like open access to information, knowledge sharing, transparency. And so you could see how these can kind of butt heads pretty easily. We also have to respect, I mean, both on our end as librarians, but also for researchers, there's limited time, energy, and funds. And like the old adage says, old habits die hard. And if you have limited time and energy, it's going to be more difficult to convince someone that they should add extra pieces to their workflow, or they should take time to do an additional step like sharing data or curating data that maybe they don't really see the value in. And then just also a lack of knowledge or understanding from both sides. So if an institution has decentralized research support, that might make it more difficult both for the different support personnel as well as researchers to know what's going on where. Researchers may have a relatively restricted view of the services libraries offer, maybe thinking it's more limited to reference finding as opposed to the wealth of other services we offer. And also from the library side, we might make assumptions about what we think researchers need and want that don't actually reflect reality. But I do see some promising overlaps. So in spite of maybe these RPT expectations and the publish in Paris culture, I do think that there are some shared values. There's research that's looked into things that researchers see contributing to a lack of research integrity and transparency. They recognize the importance of open scholarship for things like teaching materials, as well as, again, improving the transparency and integrity of research, which I think matches well with the library values I mentioned earlier. There's also a desire for finding more appropriate metrics to evaluate research impact that aren't just limited to citation counts, journal impact factors, things like that, that are pretty problematic. And then also recognition of more non-traditional research outputs. So things like data and open access textbooks and things of that nature. And I also think there's a lot of opportunities for data librarians to complement the work by other research support units. So at least in my time as a data librarian, I've definitely felt like a facilitator a lot of times. I know a lot more about what different research support there is across campus. And so a lot of times I'm directing people to other units, either within the library or outside of the library. And there's also been some good opportunities to augment the overall quality of these research services by coordinating with these groups. So maybe by offering data management and sharing plan consultations and letting sponsored programs personnel know that that's something we offer, or having conversations with the IRB about consent form language, stuff like that. So the first of two strategies that I've kind of settled on is find common ground. And so what I mean by that is, first off, get to know the researchers and their work. And what I'm about to say, I don't intend to be taken negatively, but try and appeal to people's ego. People like to talk about what they're doing. They like to talk about what they're interested in. And so by asking the researchers to tell you about what they're doing, not only does that let you get a better sense of their priorities and values, but you can also then pinpoint within their narrative what they might need, rather than just blanket telling them what you can offer, which may or may not actually match with what they actually need. And so having sort of initiated this relationship, then you also should more easily be able to speak the same language. So if you've talked with a researcher and you recognize that they really value things that relate more closely to their reappointment, promotion, and tenure expectations, and so they're looking for things that can increase citation of their papers, increase the impact and visibility of their research, then when you're talking to them about why data sharing is important and things they should be doing so that they're having high quality data deposits, then you can frame it around some of the research out there that, though the studies are relatively small, there is some indication that sharing data can help increase citation counts for the affiliated paper as well. And so thinking about things like that that may appeal to what's actually important to the researchers. And where possible, trying to catch the researchers early on rather than in the midst of their work. So some of that I think can be accomplished by coordinating with other research support personnel. So if you've got a good relationship with sponsored programs or with your IRB, then they can let researchers know, oh, hey, I see this is something you're working on. Have you reached out to the library, or did you know that the library can help you out with writing a data management and sharing plan, or with picking an appropriate data repository? And so making sure people are aware of what's going on and are willing to direct people towards the services you're offering. And then also catching researchers in this earlier planning stage gives them and you more time to adequately plan for what kind of data management they're going to need to be doing, how they're preparing for sharing down the road once the project is done. And so hopefully you can fit or complement their existing research workflows. Hey, here's a small thing we can add. Here's something that we can do to make synthesizing our metadata easier later on, and so on, rather than at the end of a project going, oh boy, I wish that this information was available, or I wish that this was better organized, and things like that. So helping you and helping them. And then second strategy is just really focusing on allies and advocacy. So the first big allies that I've definitely come to appreciate are what I'm referring to as champions. So these are going to be the researchers that, for one reason or another, consistently seek out your services and input. They're sending you their data management and sharing plans in advance of the grant submission deadline. They're reaching out to you with questions about preparing documentation for a data deposit, things like that. They see the value in the library services that are offered to them, and they consistently take advantage of it. And so making sure to maintain these relationships with these champions then hopefully will bring others to your services. So researchers most likely are going to seek advice from peers, whether that's in their field of study, in their department, things like that. And so if one of those peers happens to be one of these champions that seeks your services a lot, they're going to be more likely to recommend and direct their peer to your data services. When possible, recognizing again that we all do have limited time and energy, try to get in front of researchers where you can. If you're a subject liaison or you have a good relationship with subject liaisons in your library, getting into departmental meetings or at least getting mentioned in departmental meetings can be really helpful. If you can get in front of things like faculty councils, participate in research related events, anything you can do to get your name and your services out there. So I recently found out when a PI approached me with questions on a data management and sharing plan, I ended up advertised in our College of Engineering newsletter, which was how he had found out about my services. So all these little things make big differences. Excuse me, but also not forgetting about students and postdocs. So as much as researchers, like faculty researchers, can benefit from our services, I think it's also really important to remember our students and postdocs. They're very early in their research careers. They haven't had as much time to form a lot of these bad habits, and particularly the ones who are interested in continuing in research long term. If we can catch them earlier, get them to see the benefit of having these better workflows, doing better documentation, planning ahead of time for depositing their data in a repository, it's going to benefit them long-term in their career as well, because I don't really see a lot of these expectations going away anytime soon.
Danny, 5 minutes.
All right, thank you. And then participating in community-driven initiatives, so regional data groups like this one, Midwest Data Librarians group is another one. There's also a lot of community organized trainings and information. So if you've heard of the Research Data Management Librarian Academy, they've got a bunch of different modules that cover a lot of aspects of data librarianship and data management. And then the Framework for Open and Reproducible Research Training, or FORT, has a lot of open education materials and workshops and things that, again, cover a lot of things relating to reproducibility and research and open access and stuff. And so just remembering we don't have to do these things on our own. And then if you have opportunities to advocate at a more systemic level within your institution for policy and cultural change, just in the back of your mind, think about making sure that you align with the mission and vision of the institution. So as an example, on my end, I work at a land-grant university, and so extension is one of the pillars of our mission. And so if I'm making a pitch to administrators about why we should be better supporting and better encouraging these data management and sharing practices, I can then frame that around this extension pillar. Well, what better way to give back to the community by making our research more openly available, by sharing it more openly? And so with that, I'll take any questions, and thank you all for the opportunity to present. Appreciate all the gratitude in the chat and the pre-congrats on the PhD. It's nice to be close. Did I use RDM knowledge in my own dissertation work? Very much, yes. I feel like it caught me just at the right time, because as I've been putting my chapters together, I've been going back through data sets and analyses, and yeah, having a lot better understanding of like documentation practices, and even the way I've structured my data sets has been incredibly useful. Is there a way you've successfully hooked researchers to spend time paying attention at the beginning of the process? I don't know if I've had necessarily an obvious success story here. I think our hope is by connecting with our sponsored programs personnel who deal with a lot of grant submissions and stuff, that we can try and get mentioned sooner to researchers as they're putting together data management and sharing plans. We recently presented at a sponsored programs conference that our university hosted, so hopefully that's had some impact. But I think since I've only been in the position for a few months, I think it's a bit early to tell whether or not that's had any meaningful impact. I guess I have a friend that I'd made before I started working in the library. We had collaborated on some our stuff in the past, and she's been to a bunch of my workshops and just started a faculty position this summer. So she seems to be relatively hooked, but I think that was just more luck of us being friends before I started in the position. And so her just being more receptive to kind of what I had to say. And I think her parents are academics as well, who have had good relationships with their academic librarians. So there's a lot of like, just personally, she sees the value in that.
Thank you so much for taking the time with us today, Danny. Our next presenter is Avianna Wooten, and any further questions for Danny Kirsch we can address in the chat.
Hi, everyone. Trying to make sure all of these slides and all the screens look well. Do we all see my presentation slides right now? Yes. Okay, great. Okay, hello. It has been so incredible to experience SEDL 2023. I'm so happy to be here, and thank you all for being here with me. And also thank you to the SEDL Planning Committee for a great symposium so far. My name is Avianna Wooten, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm a graduate student in the Masters of Science and Information Science program at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I am also a graduate research assistant for the NC Collaboratory, which is a funding agency headquartered at UNC Chapel Hill. That was established by the North Carolina General Assembly in 2016 for the purpose of transforming academic research into practical information that can be used by the state and local governments and the communities they serve. Right now, you are attending Diversity and Data Services Training, a talk that is going to explore the challenges and successes of the NCDS internship program. So we don't have much time, so I'm going to kind of just dive in, and I'm going to try to kind of go through this quickly so that we have time for talking together at the end as much as possible. So, right, I just wanted to sort of reiterate the objectives of this talk, which is that by sharing my insights, experiences, and lessons learned about the National Center for Data Services, or NCDS internship program, I aim to inspire continued efforts to create inclusive and equitable opportunities for aspiring data professionals from underrepresented groups, particularly in the context of recent scrutiny of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives nationally. This talk is aiming to be informative for those interested in participating in programs like this or creating similar programs. So yeah, definitely hoping to wrap up with more time at the end for a conversation. Before we kind of get to the conversation, just a quick overview of the NCDS internship program. I'm going to zoom out for a second and then zoom back in, but the National Center of Data Services specifically, which is hosted the internship program, falls under the network of the National Library of Medicine, or NNLM. And to provide even more context to that, one of the strategic objectives of NLM, the National Library of Medicine, which NLM also falls under, as outlined in the strategic plan for 2017 through 2027, is to increase, well, one objective is to increase workforce diversity. So a program like this is sort of meant to speak to those efforts. The Data Services Internship Program by NCDS was offered for the first time last year, and this year, 2023, was the second round of this internship program and the second round of intern cohorts. The goal of the internship program is to introduce LIS graduate students from historically excluded racial and ethnic groups to data librarianship, and specifically a health sciences context. These paid internships offer, there we go. These paid internships offer opportunities to gain practical experience while working with a mentor in a guided environment on structured data-related projects. And so I kind of wanted to talk to these sort of three areas of the internship program: the recruitment process, the BIPOC training of it all, and as well as the sort of data services training aspect of the internship program. So as far as the recruitment process, it involved a sort of information session, which I think is pretty common amongst programs like this, as well as transparent scoring review criteria. I really wanted to sort of highlight that transparency and the review process, I think, is really useful for a more equitable and accessible application process. As well as there was an application coach who was not a part of the review committee that you could sort of contact to go over your application materials, get feedback, and get help. So that was also an interesting part of the recruitment process. As far as another element of the recruitment process is like less formal on the NCDS side and more so my experience is how I found out about this internship program was through an email from my dean at the time. I think the slides are automatically changing. An email from my dean at the time. And I just so happened to see the internship program. So yeah, I think maybe that might speak to how the ways to sort of get the word out about programs like this. As far as the BIPOC-centered training, I always kind of think about this when it comes to equitable work environments. How exactly do you sort of create that sort of diverse and equitable environment? And I think that can happen in a number of ways. And I'm pretty sure many of you also consider the same questions. For this program, there were not any as far as sort of particular sessions about being BIPOC graduate students or anything like that. It really felt like the way that this sort of centered training for BIPOC students was to create community basically amongst students and introduce them to sort of variety of different mentors and different people in data librarianship as a whole. And more specifically, kind of the training itself, like that, I think that's kind of the bulk of what might be this talk, was that there were 4 data projects that interns would be working on amongst 4 different sites that partnered with NCDS. So the first project was exploring the NNLM data warehouse through the NNLM National Evaluation Center at Northwestern University. The second project was to around enhanced research metrics at Edward G. Minor Libraries at the University of Rochester. So that's the project and the site. The third project would be the ecology of infectious disease. So a lot of sort of data analysis there. And that was at the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies. And the fourth project was a Git primer development, and that was through the Data Curation Network. So for each project and at each site, there was also a NCDS mentor as well as a site mentor that was there to lead the interns who were at that site through this process, through their data project essentially. Along with the site and the specific project that we were all working on separately, there were also several different workshops. And so these workshops usually happened, I would say, like maybe once a week, along with another sort of NCDS meeting. The workshop were around a variety of topics, and these workshops also kind of brought in people who were outside of the internship program. So they weren't necessarily your site mentor or NCDS, but they were probably a diverse range of librarians across the field. Some of these workshops include things like data management best practices, data policy and ethics, publishing your research, introduction to programming languages like Python, and also introductions to SQL, Git, GitHub, and this kind of ranged as well as time. As far as timing, there was an in-depth data carpentry that kind of ran over a few days, as well as the Git training that ran over, I think, half a day. So the workshops will be maybe an hour and a half, but then certain workshops were actually multiple days long. Other sort of lessons included data cleaning in Excel, OpenRefine, creating visualizations with R. And all of these kind of speak to different aspects of different internship programs. I think SQL might have been less relevant to other interns than for the ones that were working on the NNLM data warehouse project. Additionally, another type of workshop that I just really enjoyed, and I really love things like that, which was workshops centered on the personal well-being of interns and community development. So there was workshops around how do you address burnout at work and how do you promote self-care, and what does self-care actually mean? Because we say that word, it means a lot of things to different people. And the community development aspect of like also sort of time that was dedicated to us just being together, as well as a mixer, which was really fun with amongst interns as well as different people to sort of network with. I feel like networking opportunities are usually kind of hard to, so I'm looking at the time, hard to kind of really have fun with and not feel like on the spot, but that was really fun. And so like, and now I want to transition kind of to talking to sort of the challenges and successes of the program. The challenges were, I think, just some things that you're probably not surprised by. Timing. I just described the entire program, and that's really ambitious. This program was 10 weeks long, and all of that happened in 10 weeks. All of that happened in 10 weeks. So the time was a sort of constraint of the program. It was a 10-week internship program as well as 10 hours a week. So I think those constraints really, it feels difficult to do all of the things it sets out to do in that short time. Technology, sometimes it works in our favor and sometimes not. The technology onboarding, specifically for my cohort, which was the NLM data warehouse, was pretty complicated because there are a lot of security protocols that are involved in getting into a data warehouse. So it took a while to even just kind of get through that section of onboarding to even get into the actual project itself. But I definitely learned a lot about security through that process, as well as creating community through remote work. I think this is really difficult because, we don't have that time where you're just kind of meandering through office, talking to people. Everything has to be so intentional about how you create community sort of online. So those were some of the challenges of the program. And the successes. Well, the successes I would say will be the training. I felt like there were a diverse set of training workshops, as well as having mentors that were at your site as well as at NCDS. My mentor was Matt Carson, who is the head of Galter Health Sciences Library in their digital systems department. As well as Justin De La Cruz, a program specialist with NCDS. We met sort of weekly, and it was great to sort of have someone I can ask about my project, as well as have someone that I can sort of just talk to about the program as a whole and be together as a whole. And another thing that I think meant that we kind of talked about a lot in this program was confidence building, and talking about sort of imposter syndrome and how to counteract imposter syndrome. I think when you work more, you build up your confidence. So I think that was kind of one that sort of offshoot of so much training, is to build confidence in what you can contribute to an environment. The other successes I would say would be community. It's hard to know, in such a short period of time, how strong that of a community or how continuous of a community that cohort will be, or the people that we've met will be. But I think like having that dedicated time to get to know each other is so important, just like this community here, to be able to just share ideas, bounce ideas off of each other. That was really great. And I think another thing that I really, really enjoyed was not because I led it, I led a community building workshop, and it was just so incredible. The basic premise of the workshop was centered around a bring what you can activity, where people think about what is special to them, what is meaningful to them, an object that's meaningful to them. They select one or two of those things, and they present one or two of those things to the group. And I felt like I learned so much about the people that I was working with and in this cohort with through that activity. Like I learned that one of the people at NCDS actually, is a musician, and like that has not come up at all in our conversation. But I think we really get to know each other as people as well as professionals through that type of community building, and then that kind of leads to the impact question. I feel like we really are always stronger together, and where we see impact is often where we see communities being built. And of course, I just like have this big square here for care, really treating each other with care and investment, and how we are all kind of working together, whether that be interns to their mentors, mentors to their interns. I think that is something that really is withstanding. Okay, I was trying to zoom through this a little quick, a little quickly to leave time for conversation. I'm not sure. I see 14 minutes on my timer, so I might be right at time, or maybe not. But thank you all. I wanted to sort of mention these resources over here to learn more about the program, for anything that I might have missed, learn more about that cohort, because I think one thing I didn't talk about is the diverse background of people in the cohort, as well as the data carpentry. Like there's a link to the data carpentry we use, and other sorts of an LLM training that would probably informed a lot of the workshops. So just in case those are some things that you all are interested in. How are we doing on time?
You have 4 minutes for questions.
Yay, okay, well, that was great. Okay, so we got through that really quickly. Before we move to questions, I also want to acknowledge that the project was funded from federal funds from the National Library of Medicine, the National Institute of Health, under the cooperative agreement with the University of Massachusetts. This content is the responsibility of its author, me, and does not necessarily reflect the views of the National Institute of Health. So after that acknowledgement, now we have time for questions and conversation. And I will stop sharing so I can see you all. Just look at the chat. Yes, Chelsea, the time constraint. I mentioned working at the collaboratory because that is another funding agency, and time is always one of them. Time is always, it's hard. Timing is always hard. Was anything missing? As far as things that felt like they were missing, I would say that maybe similar to certain things that have come up throughout the symposium, it's you're quickly introduced to a concept, and then you're introduced to another concept. So at times it felt like maybe there wasn't something missing, but there was a lot there to sort of go through without sort of applying those concepts. Have I decided where I want to work after graduation? Academic library, health sciences library. That is a great question. I have not decided where I want to work after graduation. I have decided on principles, which I guess is like, I feel like is that a cop-out answer? That's a really cop-out answer, but I have decided on principles for which that I want to kind of have my labor contribute towards, and that would definitely be like equity and information services. So really an environment that would support me doing work that would create sort of equitable access to information and interaction with information. I see so many thank you, so many great things in the chat. I see another question. If one can't get into these sort of limited availability programs, do you have suggestions for how students can get this sort of support in other ways? Yeah, that is a great question. I think that one thing that I have noticed in librarianship as a field, and I have also noticed in the previous field that I was in, I was previously in the museum field, which is that people really like talking to people. People really like talking to people. Librarians love it when you talk to them. So I think one thing that I would suggest to students who cannot get into programs like this is that maybe looking at those sites specifically, or looking at the people who work at those sites and getting in contact with them and speaking with them, and maybe going about ways that you can sort of build relationships that way, not necessarily, because I think one thing, I have been in multiple internship programs by this point in my career, and I feel like the community is always the like withstanding thing about them. Like getting to know people, having that sort of cohort of people to bounce ideas off of and getting to know people, that is something that will continue with you for the rest of your work and career. So I think building relationships in any way that you can is great. And even if you cannot get into this internship program, there are definitely probably people around you that you can be building those sort of relationships with. I think also maybe if you do reach out to someone who like might have site-specific research or site-specific activities that they're doing, I would say also talking to them about what is prescient right now. Like what are things that you think I should be like learning about or thinking about.
Thank you so much for your insight there. Really excellent presentation. Our last short talk for the day before our closing remarks is going to be by Dessi Kirilova from the Qualitative Data Repository.
Yes, hi everyone, and thank you. Just one quick second to get my slides started here. Yes, so hi again. I'm Dessi Kirilova from the Qualitative Data Repository, and my co-author on this and colleague that I work very closely with, Sebastian Karcher, is unfortunately not able to co-present with me this time, but sends his greetings to this wonderful community that we love being a part of. And our work and small presentation here this year is on researcher attitudes to data curation at QGR specifically. So as the title suggests, this is a fairly narrow research project, but we did do it as a research project and not just merely as an internal kind of quality assurance type of survey, which it could have been. We decided that there are broader lessons to learn from what we were going to do anyway. And, one second, because I'm not able to advance my slides for some reason. There we go. Because we, as I'm sure many of you also are familiar with, the growing data curation literature that looks at various aspects of data curation, premised on the idea that data curation adds value to data used as research outputs, or viewed or handled, however you want to think about it, as research outputs kind of in their own right, not just merely as supplementary things to written research outputs. And so here, just for anybody who might be interested in knowing more about it, I've listed a bunch of different groups and individuals who study these topics from a variety of angles. Excuse me. And we just knew that, like I said, that there's this growing awareness of the role of data curation, and wanted to see if by surveying our particular depositors, people who have come to QGR with the intent of depositing, if we can add in some more kind of generalizable way to this growing literature, even though, like I said, in a very particular, from our very particular angle. What we decided to do methodologically, was to use an existing survey that we became aware of, that the colleagues at the Data Curation Network had done in 2021, and they've been publishing on it. And they published their survey instrument, which thankfully we were able to adopt, because we actually were interested in very much similar questions to what they had used. The definition of data curation that we used, that we presented to the respondents, actually was the exact same one, again, in the interest of kind of building up and building upon on things that existed. And the definition has a very pragmatic focus. It really kind of lists the activities that data curators perform in assisting data preparation, especially for data sharing purposes. So as I said, we took that survey instrument and we changed it a little bit, and really added to it questions that worked better for our purposes, both taking into account the deposit curation publication process as we conducted at QGR, which is a little bit different, obviously, from the Data Curation Network's setup and process. And also the biggest difference, I think, that we implemented was we wanted to add the voices of depositors who had started projects in QGR but have not yet published them. Whether or not these get published is an open question that is not part of the survey, but we wanted to add that kind of different perspective, which we thought would allow us to understand some of the key barriers to data publication from people who otherwise, had the incentive or the motivation to try at least take one step in that direction. And in the sense that we, with the responses from both types of published data depositors and unpublished data depositors, we eliminate one kind of bias that we call the data publication bias. Very quickly on the methodology before I get to the results. It's a very small survey, as you can imagine. Our repository is a niche repository. It's only been around for a few years. So the total sample of people who had confirmed email addresses and whose projects fit the scope of QDR, because we have actually a lot more entries that we've decided are just not even a good fit for QDR. So those we did not even reach out to. So the total starting sample was 370 data depositors. That's not exactly the same as data authors, because oftentimes there are multiple authors on a project, and we just contacted the one main contact that they had listed. And they were distributed as 143 published projects and 227 unpublished. And as you see, the results, the respondent rate is, not uncommon, I guess, in academic online surveys, but not very high either. The highest that we got was, 18% response rate for fully completed surveys. That's what the little two different numbers stand for. So 21% started a survey and 80% completed it for the published, and about half of that for the unpublished. And to compare that to, again, the example and model that we used from DCN, they had over 40% average respondents rate. And we think that's obviously because they actually have the institutional connection. For those of you who know how DCN works, it's the individual, campus-based curators and librarians that probably, I think, sent their survey out to people whom they had served. Whereas for us, we don't have that direct connection really with the depositors through an institution. Anyway, other limitations are that a lot of people, so some of our oldest deposits, which is, they were commissioned deposits way back in 2015 when the repository was getting started. We kind of wanted at the time to present models for what qualitative data publication might look like. So some of the people who chose to respond, but it said things like, I don't remember, on a variety of topics. So there's some kind of recency bias, I'm sure, in the responses. Obviously, the non-response or self-selection bias, the people who chose to respond probably are the ones that had the strongest opinions for one reason or another. And it was not anonymous. I mean, we reached out to these people. We knew who they were. We knew what their projects were. And so probably some of the responses that are very positive might reflect social desirability bias. It was a very brief survey, as I said, mostly based on the existing DCN instrument, plus a few more questions. Conducted just very recently, as you see, between September and October of this year. And then very quickly, we had both the quantitative and free text qualitative questions. So some of the findings. One question that is the first one actually that we started with is, did people expect curation? And we were not particularly surprised, because obviously we've corresponded with these people. So we knew that in many cases, people were themselves surprised that there was going to be an actual process of curation. And we don't see a huge difference between the published and unpublished depositors on that particular question. Let's say roughly half of them expected it, but then almost half of both of those groups didn't. They came to QDR not recognizing that they're going to receive curation services for their data. Then we asked whether people had experience publishing in any other data repositories aside from the project that we worked with them on. And there's a big difference here, interestingly, where amongst the people whose deposits ended up being published in the time frame, again, roughly half and half had experiences publishing in other repositories and half didn't. Whereas amongst the unpublished, those that somehow have stalled in the process, the vast majority did not have experience with any other repository. So that might be telling us something interesting about the kind of types of people who are more familiar, I guess, with repositories, with the process of publication, and that might have enabled to some degree their completion of the process with us. Now, we asked the question related directly to that initial premise that I talked about, which is that data curation adds value, to the research data that people create, and especially if they get shared, that value gets realized. And so we asked people, did they think that data sharing was worth the effort? And we see, maybe some more disagreement here, but in the lower numbers amongst people whose projects ended up being published. And then, I don't know, a little bit more of a bunching up of answers, so not as much divergence on the opinions of those whose projects have not been published yet. On the topic of whether the process was worth the effort for them. And then the most interesting probably in the quantitative questions, what were some of their biggest hurdles? And we asked that for both people who overcame the hurdles and people who haven't yet. And there's some difference here. So amongst the published, the most number of people said the additional effort required for providing proper documentation. So as you can imagine, again, thinking about what data curation involves, one of the things that we work with people on is asking for a bunch of details on their method and their project and their approach and so on, that ends up being part of the documentation that accompanies the data themselves, right? We at QDR think that that's very important, and we do not allow projects to be published without what we think is at least sufficient, documentation. And people found that additional effort to describe, their data for others to be a big hurdle, even if they accomplished it. And then other, which that's a little bit more difficult to interpret. Obviously, we do have free text response that we're looking at, but that's the second biggest hurdle was listed as other. Technical, you see that both on the published and unpublished end. That part really surprised us. And we think now, again, having looked at the details of some of the responses, that this has to do with a lot of our earliest depositors. And as I told you, there's really a big gap in or a big range of periods when people initially deposited their materials with us. So the technical hurdles, we believe, really will not appear in future iterations of this survey, because QDR has just, improved and redesigned its site. But it was still kind of an interesting thing to see. Another interesting thing is that the curation fee that we do charge, we try to make it very reasonable. In many cases, it's covered under institutional membership, depending on the institution that a depositor comes from. But nonetheless, and we always can issue waivers. We're still in a position financially where that's actually very common. And we pointed out in the very first interaction with a depositor. And nonetheless, people, I don't know if they didn't take us seriously on that point, that when we said you can request a waiver, please tell us if the fee is a financial burden. We'd rather work with you on that rather than not see the data deposit for that reason. But nonetheless, it just stayed in people's minds, I guess, as a hurdle, even if it was eventually overcome. So those are some of the things that we found interesting. Oh, another thing that is actually not present here, not very highly present in the data, is we were surprised that more people didn't point to informed consent being a hurdle to data publication, because in reality, that's actually what in most cases that have led to non-publication of data, that's been the hurdle. But I guess some of it is probably just the self-selection of who chose to answer. So probably the people who answered did not have the types of, either didn't have human participant data, because we publish a variety of qualitative data, not just human participant, or their informed consent did not prohibit data sharing. But in reality, actually, we think that's one of the biggest hurdles, and it did not bear out in the response of these particular people. And then we asked the question about future plans with QDRs, that a little bit is conditioned on whether they have new data that are a good fit. Because as I mentioned, because we are a domain niche repository with a very specific scope, not any kind of data project is a good fit. And so first we ask people, do they have data that they've collected in the meantime that may be a good fit? Some didn't know, some didn't. And then the subsequent question, whether they are planning to, or whether they're interested in, again, depositing those data with QDR, only refers to those that said, yes, I do have appropriate data. So you can kind of see the responses there. Almost an even. This is actually not a no. I don't know if you can see because of the menu bar here, but the middle is a no. So none of the people who were successful in publishing data so far said no. More than half said yes, and the other respondents were unsure. So we think that's kind of a good sign. And then a similar kind of question about would they recommend QDR to colleagues, peers, along the lines of what the previous two presenters said, that how important it is to find, champions and people who promote the message of data sharing in this case, or data sharing with a particular repository, but just more generally thinking about data transparency. So finding these champions, we are glad to see that amongst those who have published a project, the vast majority would recommend QDR. So the experience, with all its hurdles and everything, still is one that they would encourage other researchers around them to take. And then amongst unpublished, similarly, a high number of respondents said yes, and then some said no, and some were unsure. And then for the qualitative responses, which were really free text responses to a couple of questions that we added, we asked people what they thought was the greatest value added of curation to their data. And I'm not going to read all of them, but just broadly, people like the fact that the QDR staff, our curation staff, asked them questions that made, that enhanced the documentation for sure, even if they found it a hurdle, but that made them imagine who their audience is. That's why I put that particular quote up top, because I think it kind of captures a lot of what people listed as the greatest value added. So that person said that someone was thinking about what the audience would benefit from knowing, so that I could think about filling the gaps. And again, that I think is a new or novel experience for people who haven't shared data, right? They don't, they prepared and organized and did whatever with the data for their own purposes, or maybe for their research team's purposes. But to think about what others might also need to know to make sense of these data or to make use of them down the line, I think is a novel experience. And having human curation provides that kind of angle. Again, some of our specific documentation requirements were highly appreciated by people, even though they thought that was a bit of a hurdle to overcome.
Dessi, we're at 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna, like I said, the rest of the responses I've selected here can still broadly be can broadly fit under that umbrella of thinking about the audience. Then the greatest hurdles, they kind of differed, somewhat depending on the type of project that people had, but the level of effort needed. So I'm going to quote the one from the unpublished side here, the level of effort needed. And we recognize that. I mean, we all know that to do data publication well, even when it's accompanied by human curation, it takes time. This parting words, I'll point to just these two little under unpublished, the second and third bullet point, that people's comments that they kind of sent to us as parting messages were requests to make our guidelines clearer and to continue simplifying our process. So even though people found value in the data curation we provide, it was something that still can undergo better, improvement and maybe making it very clear up front. So the lessons part, which again, I think maybe for this crowd, which does not work at a very specific repository like me, might be applicable. The kinds of things that all of us from the data librarian community, other repositories, people based at university libraries can work on together, recognize the challenge of communicating different curation levels to people. So most people, or not most, but many people assume self-curation, self-publication, which is not the case in many repositories, and it certainly is not the case in many trusted digital repositories. So I think to reduce the level of frustration of researchers, this kind of point, I think, needs to be brought up more maybe than we've been doing, so that there's variety of curation levels, and finding the best repository is important, but also it's good to recognize what the process that repository would require involves. Then communicating the existence and content of curation where it's relevant in any kind of research data management. I think trainings that could start being mentioned and brought up so that people can start thinking about that also in the beginning of the research life cycle. So again, a lot of things that we heard, especially in Danny's presentation earlier, which we all know, but from a kind of a different angle. So bringing it up early on, in this case, referring to data curation also is important. We've discovered both in our other work, but also in some of the responses, the journals are even journals who have data sharing expectations are not sufficiently and uniformly familiar with curated repositories. So sometimes journals expect the instant publication of data. So communicating that to journal audiences is also important. And then for us specifically working on reducing the effort required from researchers after the end of the deposit. And we hope that, the expansion of data management planning, data management and sharing planning requirements by funders will facilitate moving that step or that work upstream in the beginning of a research project. I think I'm at time now, so I'm just going to say, if you work in any kind of repository, whether it's an institutional or domain or other kind, it's worth doing that kind of deposit survey. It certainly gives you a sense of things to work on, but also I think in aggregation over time, we'll probably learn very interesting things about the value of data curation and related challenges across different types of data and different repository venues. So thank you very much for your attention. Oh, I guess I don't know that we have time for questions. Can the organizers please tell me if I should look at the ones to open the chat to respond verbally or to just type later? Hello?
Hi, sorry. I think there have been a couple of questions in chat. And so yeah, if you could answer those in chat, that would be great, because I think we're at time.
Okay, I'll make sure to do that then. Just please don't end the meeting so I can see them.
We're not going to end the meeting. I'm going to share some closing remarks, and so please do stick around for that.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Everybody see my screen? Okay. Great. So I don't know if you can hear, but today is homecoming and the marching band is practicing outside my window, so for the parade. So anyway, that's going on in the background. Apologies for that. So anyway, for the closing remarks, I just wanted to share a few things. First of all, thank you all for being here. SEDLS is a wonderful symposium that happens every year. This year we had over 130 attendees from across 85 institutions from across the Southeast United States, but also beyond that. This is just some information on all the talks and posters and workshops we had. I'd love to give a huge thank you again. Maybe everyone can give a little round of applause for all of our speakers from the symposium this year. Okay, a couple of reminders and some opportunities that I want to let you know about. One is that the RDAP call for proposals is currently open, but it does close next week. So please put in your submissions for proposals for that. Another fantastic conference. And there are two other potential publishing opportunities. Consider submitting your work on your presentation to either the IASIS Quarterly, which is a peer-reviewed publication, or to Research Data Q, which puts out editorials. Their call for proposals is open, and actually I think one of our speakers earlier today had an article published in Research Data Q. So these links are all published in the shared notes doc. If maybe somebody could pop that in the chat, I would appreciate it. Lastly, just some final things here. The attendee certificate is available at this link if you need any kind of proof of attendance, and the recordings will be forthcoming into the OSF along with presentation slides, posters, and other materials can be there. You'll find that after the conference is over. And then I'd really like to take a moment to just remind you that this is I think the 6th year that we've had SEDLS, 4th year of it being online. And as you know, this is just a totally volunteer run symposium, and it's not really part of a large organization. We just prepare the symposium every year. And so two things here. One is that we'd really like to hear your feedback. Just take a couple of minutes to fill out that survey. We really do take a look at those and see what everyone wants, because the conference is here for you. And so we want to make sure that it's hitting everyone's needs. Also, I want to let you know that the planning interest survey is also available. So if you are even having any kind of inkling of maybe I'd like to help out with this next year, do fill out that form. It's not a, signing up that you're fully committed to it, but if you're interested, then you're able to stay in the loop and learn more about what's coming up in terms of planning for next year. I would like to also thank our support from the RDAP Association for helping us with the funding for this, and awkwardly thank myself for hosting the Zoom. And a huge shout out to all of our organizers this year. We had a really large group of enthusiastic volunteers to help. If any of you fellow organizers would like to unmute and just say a few words, like, feel free to do so at this time. Thanks, Lenny. Okay, well, if anybody has any other thoughts, or if you're thinking about joining in for 2024 and you're not sure exactly what that involves, please reach out to any of us from the SEDLS 2023 Planning Committee, and we'd be happy to talk to you about our experiences. I also want to give a huge shout out to everyone who helped add in anything into the shared notes document. That's a great resource for everyone going forward. So with that, I'd really like to conclude the main portion of SEDLS 2023. We are going to have a break for the next half hour for anyone who is joining us for the Power BI workshop, which will start at 1 o'clock Eastern. And you should have that Zoom link in a separate email. And otherwise, we're going to keep this room open, I think, for the next 15 or so minutes. If anybody wants to chat or ask questions to any of the speakers, if you're sticking around, please do. And look forward to next year, 2024.